April 1814. For 10 long years, one man had dominated Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Under his brilliant military leadership, France built an empire that stretched across the continent. But at last, his enemies united against him. After a series of crushing defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the small island of Elba, while the Bourbon monarchy returned to France under King Louis XVIII, a ruler many saw as weak and bloated with the same corruption that once fueled the French Revolution. Yet rumors soon reached Napoleon's ears. Whispers that the French people still longed for him, that they despised the monarchy and the nobles who had crawled back into power. And in Vienna, where Europe's leaders gathered to decide the future, his enemies were divided and arguing among themselves. Napoleon saw his chance. After just 10 months in exile, he escaped Elba and landed in France. The soldiers sent to arrest him joined his side instead. Soon, all of France followed. But the moment the news reached Vienna, the coalition powers put aside their quarrels. They declared Napoleon an outlaw, and once again, Europe prepared for war. Napoleon knew his only hope was to strike fast. He planned to crush his enemies before they could unite and invade France. His targets: Field Marshal Blücher's Prussian army and the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces, both camped in Belgium. If they joined together, he'd be outnumbered. But separately, he could destroy them one by one. Napoleon's army crossed the border near Charleroi, cutting between the two coalition forces. He sent Marshal Ney to seize the key crossroads at Quatre-Bras, where Ney clashed with Wellington's troops, still scrambling to form their lines. The British and their allies held on through repeated French assaults. The crossroads remained in Allied hands. Meanwhile, Napoleon himself attacked Blücher's Prussian army near the village of Ligny. It was a brutal, close-quarters battle, but the French emerged victorious. Blücher, at 72 years old, led a cavalry charge in person and had his horse shot out from under him, barely escaping capture. The Prussians retreated, but they weren't destroyed. Napoleon ordered Marshal Grouchy to pursue them while he turned his main army toward Wellington. Wellington, learning of Blücher's defeat the next morning, withdrew his forces south through the rain to a defensive position near the village of Waterloo, just 8 miles from Brussels. There, Blücher promised to march to his aid by morning. So Wellington stood his ground. He chose his battlefield carefully, a low ridge giving his troops cover from French cannon fire. His right flank anchored on the farmhouse of Hougoumont, his center on La Haye-Sainte, and his left on Pays-Platé, all fortified, all manned by elite troops. Still, Wellington's army was a mix: British, Dutch, and German soldiers, many with little or no combat experience. They would have to hold off Napoleon's veterans until the Prussians arrived, or be wiped out. Sunday, June 18, 1815. The day dawned bright and clear. Napoleon ordered Grouchy to keep the Prussians occupied while he crushed Wellington at Waterloo and opened the road to Brussels. But Grouchy became bogged down fighting the Prussian rear guard at Wavre, while the main Prussian army slipped away and marched toward the sound of the guns. At Waterloo, Napoleon delayed his attack, waiting for the ground to dry after heavy rain, a decision that would cost him dearly. The battle began around 11 a.m. with a diversionary assault on Hougoumont. Napoleon hoped Wellington would send reserves there, leaving the center exposed. But the defenders of Hougoumont held firm all day, repelling wave after wave of attacks. At one point, French troops burst through the main gate, only to be trapped and cut down inside the courtyard. Wellington would later call it the decisive moment of the battle. Around noon, 80 French cannons opened fire on the main Allied line. Most of Wellington's troops sheltered on the reverse slope, but the barrage tore deadly gaps through their ranks. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched his infantry. They were met by disciplined volleys of musket fire, and then by the thunder of British heavy cavalry. The French columns broke apart under the charge, hundreds cut down or trampled as 2 of their sacred eagle standards were captured. But the British cavalry, carried away by victory, chased too far. Their horses exhausted, they were counterattacked by French lancers and decimated. Among the dead was Major General Sir William Ponsonby, commander of the Union Brigade. By 4 p.m., Marshal Ney believed the Allies were retreating. He ordered a massive cavalry charge. But the British infantry stood firm, forming hollow squares with bayonets ready. Wave after wave of French cavalry thundered forward, only to be repelled again and again, shot down or forced to circle helplessly. Without infantry or artillery support, Ney's charge was a disaster. Then came a new threat. Blücher's Prussians arrived, attacking Napoleon's flank and capturing the village of Plancenoit. Napoleon was forced to send in his reserves to retake it, spreading his army thinner. By 6 p.m., French infantry finally captured La Haye Sainte, the farmhouse in the center. They dragged artillery forward and began blasting the British formations at close range. Casualties skyrocketed. It seemed Wellington's army might be destroyed where it stood. But Napoleon's situation was just as desperate. The Prussians were pouring in. His troops were exhausted. His reserves were almost gone. So he made one final gamble, calling on his Imperial Guard, the most feared soldiers in Europe. At 7:30 p.m., 3,000 of these veterans marched across the corpse-strewn field, straight toward the Allied center. Wellington's men rose from behind the ridge and unleashed devastating musket volleys. When they fixed bayonets and advanced, the Guard faltered and then broke. For the first time in history, Napoleon's Imperial Guard had retreated. Wellington seized the moment, ordering a full advance. At the same time, the Prussians retook Plancenoit, collapsing Napoleon's flank. Panic rippled through the French lines. Soldiers fled in all directions. Only the Old Guard held their ground, forming a doomed rear guard as their emperor escaped the field. Napoleon abandoned his carriage and barely evaded capture. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Wellington and Blücher met outside an unnamed La Belle Alliance, Napoleon's former headquarters. Blücher thought it the perfect name for their victory, the Beautiful Alliance. Wellington preferred a simpler name, Waterloo. It had been, in Wellington's words, a damned close-run thing. One of the bloodiest battles of its time. Nearly 50,000 men killed or wounded. The wounded lay on the field for days, many dying without care. Napoleon was utterly defeated. Unable to rebuild his army, he surrendered to the British and was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There would be no escape. He died 6 years later. Waterloo ended an era. Europe entered 40 years of relative peace. The great powers would not fight again until the summer of 1914. For decades after the battle, early photographers captured the faces of Napoleon's surviving soldiers. Old men now, in their 70s and 80s, Sergeant Tanya of the Imperial Guard, Moret of the 2nd Hussars, Verline of the 2nd Guard Lancers. Their weathered faces are the last living link to a war that changed the course of history.